Perfection.
Have you ever been in that situation? You play a video or a mobile game and you really fall in love with the design of one or several of the characters? So much so that you really want to have them as a collectible, only to find out that they don't exist? Or at least not in the quality you desire? Well, let me show you why you will probably never own your favorite video game character collectible. I mean, creating a good sculpt from those assets those game publishers already possess shouldn't be that difficult, should it? They already have the models, although not with a high level of detail, I might add. They have all of the professional artwork, or at least they should, and they certainly have some talented folks at their disposal who could easily achieve this. So, why aren't we seeing more collectibles? Especially in the era of 3D printing. And yes, I am aware that video game collectibles are out there, but the variation is a little bit, let's say, lacking. But given the price point of them, man, this seems quite lucrative. So why isn't it done more? I will illustrate my point using a model from an unspecified mobile game. Let's look at this character for example and try to... Wait, what is that?
Later.
Okay, let's just ignore that. Anyway, back to the character. What could be so hard about creating a 3D printable sculpt from that? Why don't we just take the model itself, load it into Blender for example, and then start fleshing it out? So, here we are. And for the record, I did not rip the model from the game. I feel the need to make that very clear. Instead, this model in particular can be downloaded on the internet for free. And you don't even have to commit to an extensive search. But that doesn't matter, because like this, the model is absolutely useless. You can see there is a lot of stuff just missing. First of all, the level of detail. Yeah, we can change that. But then there is the ornaments, or the lack thereof. Well, we can use some sculpting to add them. But what about the weapon clipping through the cape? Let's adjust his pose. And this is where things will start falling apart. As you can see, the model is just one big mesh. And if you animate and pose it, the entire mesh will deform. It doesn't really matter in-game because you won't pay attention to it anyway, but in our case, let's just say I have never seen steel plates deform like they do in video or mobile games. But now I hear you say, why don't you just separate those parts from the model? The point with that is that the geometry does not represent what the texture seems to indicate. I don't have time to go into detail with this. But we can conclude from that we have to start modeling from scratch. And that is exactly what I went on to do. Now we are really getting into the details. And I will show you at least some of the footage for everything I created. I don't want anyone to claim that I stole the model, like ripping it from the game and then selling it as my own work. Also, there seem to be people out there who claim that such things cannot be done. And by that, I mean creating a model from scratch that looks exactly like the one from the game, only with a way higher level of detail. But to that I would reply, yes, it can be done, but it requires a little bit of work. And by a little bit, I mean like 5 days-ish. The head of the stag that will be placed on the shield is beginning to take form. The sculpting is probably one of the easiest parts in the process. What really takes a lot of effort is creating the base meshes that you can then sculpt on. Some people are skilled enough to just take a basic sphere and then sculpt everything from that, but not me. And this is what the finished shield looks like. What you have seen in the last 2 minutes is a very condensed time-lapse of what took a few hours. And from here on, it is not really getting easier. Now to the armor. What could be so hard about that? It is just a few basic shapes with a few ornaments slapped onto it, you would say. And I might be inclined to agree. The only problem is the amount of separate armor parts. In this case, the armor consists of 46 different elements, and most of them with ornamentation. So this is quite a number. And believe me, after modeling all those parts, you are just glad when you got it over with. But most of the parts will be just mirrored, because you have a left pauldron and a right pauldron, a left and a right gauntlet, don't you? Yes, and in the modeling process you can cut a few corners. But you still have to animate and pose the model in the end, and this is where the sheer number of elements gets annoying, because each of them needs to be rigged individually. One thing I still need to mention. When you create a model that should later be 3D printed, you need to put some additional thought into it. You need to make sure that it can be printed, which means that you probably have to separate the model into different parts at some point. This is not so much of a big deal for a character in armor, because you can separate parts where two pieces of armor intersect. You will mostly find some clean edges there. For example, this model I create here is separated into 4 different parts. The helmet, the right arm holding the polearm, the left arm holding the shield and the main body. But things will get really tricky if you have a lot of cloth and capes. We do have a cape on this knight, and we also have armor pieces above the cape. Let's ignore the question how they are even held in place for a moment and just acknowledge that separating the model at edges where armor and cape intersect is not a good idea. It is also not fun to have a hooded character, because it is really hard to separate the head from the body without anyone noticing the cut in the finished model. And the most important thing I almost forgot, every piece needs to have a thickness for it to be able to be 3D printed. You don't necessarily have that in games, because in those environments you need to save on file size for performance, so you just give the mesh a thickness of 0 in quite many cases. We on the other side are in a different dilemma. We need to make the parts actually thicker than they would be in real life. Take a real life cape for example, scale it down to a miniature scale and then try to manufacture it, using 3D printing or injection molding or whatever. Good luck making this work. So this fact leads to some annoying cases of parts clipping through each other in the modeling process. The horse. When I initially looked at the model to make note of all the ornaments that need to be modeled and I saw the horse, I was a little bit discouraged if I could actually do it. Maybe I was just overcomplicating and overthinking it. Seems to be pretty standard for a German engineer. But after simplifying it in my head a little bit, sculpting went quite smoothly. What you are about to see is the most difficult part, which is the helmet. I had to model it in 3 separate parts: the helmet itself, the visor or faceplate, and the horns. The latter were the easy parts. Just a few curves, add thickness to them, a little bit of sculpting, and that's it. Then to the helmet. A little bit more difficult because of all the fluting that goes on here, but still nothing compared to the visor. The geometry here is so complex that it took me like 3 to 4 approaches to finally get it right. You have the reinforcements on the front and above the eye slits, the part that extends above it, and everything is curved. There are almost no planar faces in this one. Sounds like fun, doesn't it? Before we go on to the last part, which would be the cape, just a few words about some of the details. The structure on the gambeson was done really quickly, no major obstacles here, just basic sculpting. But then the part I mostly try to avoid, which are the belts and buckles. I really dislike modeling them, but unfortunately I really don't have an easy way out of that. And it still needs to be done. And finally the cape. Here we get into what I mentioned earlier, the thickness issue. I needed to model the cape way thicker than it would be in real life. And dealing with all the intersecting issues was a real pain. But after that was solved, finishing the model was only a matter of using a texture brush for the fur. Before we print it, let's take a final look at the model. Perfect.
1 hour later. The next morning.
Finally to painting the model. I only focused on the shield, which is the hardest part to paint because of all the fire and glowing effects. After priming the model with white color, I applied a coat of brown to all the parts that will later be painted gold. Gold is kinda hard to paint, so you need this base of brown. Otherwise, the color would not really be covering, and you would need several layers of gold paint. So this is way easier. We will work our way from dark to light, starting with brown first, then to a more brass color until we get to gold. After the gold color is applied, the whole model will be painted with a very thin black. The color will flow into all the gaps and create some nice effects. Now we get to painting the fire and glowing effects. In the original model, fire is coming out of the stag's eyes on the shield. I did my best to paint that. Took me quite some time. Here we are working from light to dark. White in the center where the fire is the hottest, then move on to yellow and orange and finally red where the fire is coolest. But the most challenging effect is this fiery glow that radiates out from the big circle in the center of the shield. So first I prepared the area around that circle with a base coat of yellow. Well, it was more than just one coat, more like 3 or 4. Then in some of these spots I added some white from where the source of the glow would come from. I really struggled to blend the colors. Maybe because this is the first time I have ever tried painting effects like these. And at that point I just told myself, screw it. I just could not get a bright yellow as base, so I used my airbrush to paint over everything I had done so far. So let's do it all over again. But right up to the end of my recording, I just couldn't get it right. Off camera, I tried one last time and finally I got it. I am much happier with the result now. The effects, at least to me, look really good. I would even say I am somewhat proud of that model. I can't remember the last time that happened. And I have painted models and miniatures for many years. Anyway, that concludes the video. It took me accumulated 5 days to finish this model. You see, 3D printing a model from a video or mobile game is not as straightforward as it seems. It takes a lot of effort and time, which is probably why you won't find many game publishers doing it. And let's not get into the 3D printing itself, where a lot of issues can occur. But now you hopefully understand why you will probably never own your favorite character from a video or mobile game as a collectible.